Welcome to the March 2019 episode of the Cerini Nonprofit Connection, a webinar designed to provide meaningful insight into nonprofit leadership so that they can run their organizations more effectively. Today, I'm extremely pleased to have as our guest Christine Deska, President of Nonprofit Strategies. Thank you, Christine, for being part of today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ken. Good to see you.
Same here. One of the things I love about having you as a guest here is you pretty much can cover any topic within the nonprofit sector, and you can kind of handle anything that I kind of throw at you.
So we'll see, won't we?
Yeah, we will. I'm going to actually challenge you on this. Before we get started, though, why don't you talk a little bit about how nonprofit sector strategies assists the nonprofit sector?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. And thanks so much again for having us. We're really excited to be here. When I say us, I speak of Nonprofit Sector Strategies. So we're a public benefit corporation, and we serve the nonprofit space primarily in three ways. One, custom service offerings. So we partner with a lot of nonprofit organizations to take them through their strategic planning processes. Within that, we also develop continuous improvement plans. So that's the second way we provide custom services to nonprofits. Okay. And then thirdly, we really focus on board development, board engagement, board management. And we have a product called Bell's Board that helps nonprofit boards function more efficiently.
Awesome. So we'll come back to the board development and board piece in a minute. Let's kind of start off with that first piece, the whole aspect of strategic planning and organizational direction. One of the things that you find is that the nonprofit sector has a tough time kind of understanding direction, understanding the impact that they're having, understanding how to identify and actually measure that impact. What are you seeing out there in the marketplace, and how can organizations maybe do that a little more effectively?
That's a great question. So, traditionally, the nonprofit sector has had a tough time focusing on various metrics and quantifying their success. So this is a big struggle that we see among the organizations that we work with, those in our network. And just briefly, my background is in the nonprofit space, about 15 years working day in and day out for mission-driven efforts. And so I saw this firsthand as well. And so a lot of times, especially with smaller nonprofits, you have an organization that was started with a passion, started with a cause, and then it becomes how to handle the operations of that not-for-profit, which is in some ways a business. And so we help organizations very often in defining the right metrics. How are they measuring their social impact? Because now more than ever, resources are strained. Organizations are sometimes fighting for the same resources. And how to stand apart from other nonprofit organizations oftentimes comes down to how are you conveying your social impact. And so we talk with a lot of organizations about how they can approach that kind of big topic.
So when you think about social impact, I mean, first of all, there are so many components to it. If I'm a larger organization and I have maybe 20 different funding sources and lines of business, social impact could be different in each line. And even if I'm in a smaller organization, when you think about impact, sometimes it's really difficult to measure impact because, maybe I'm providing behavioral support or something like that, or the time frame for measuring impact. If I'm doing early intervention, how do I determine what impact I had until maybe somewhere down the road? So how does an organization, first of all, decide what are the right measurements or keys to measure? How many is the right number? How many is too much?
Well, the answer to how many is the answer to everything. It depends. But we partner with organizations and go through this process. And so often the starting point is, what are your key performance indicators, right? And that's a term used more in business than in nonprofit, but it gets organizational leadership thinking. What are the key factors that define our success? So usually by asking that question, we can start with what the organization is aiming for. Okay. So if the goal, for example, on the programmatic side is program growth, what are the metrics that lead to program growth? Is it, if it's a social enterprise model, it could be growing program revenue. Okay, then taking it down a step, it's what operational metrics come together to grow program revenue and therefore grow your social impact. So
like if you're talking about like a school, the metric you'd be looking at maybe is number of students or something like that, because that then deals with the top line revenue and then ultimately, hopefully, the bottom line profit.
So the number of students is an example of an important metric. If you are a school, the number of clients, number of individuals served, these are all operational metrics that are really important in an organization. Being able to show, for example, a donor, look, with your dollars, we have served X number of folks. But then, as you know, what we really like to talk about as well is going from those outputs to how many to outcomes, right? And so we talk a lot about social return on investment. And this is kind of commonly referred to as the triple bottom line.
Okay.
So for any business folks listening, put an S in front of your ROI, because it's about a lot more than profit. It's also about the planet. It's also about the people that you're serving. And so we talk with nonprofits about the importance of long-term planning as it relates to how you're conveying your social impact. So for example, going back to the school setting as an example. So you've had 300 students go through your school, but are you then staying in touch with those students to figure out the impact that you've had? Because maybe your STEM or STEAM curriculum is above the rest in some way. Maybe you're doing something unique and innovative. How is what you're doing actually impacting your students in long term? Are they gainfully employed in ways that their peers are not? Are they engaged in their communities in different ways because of things that your school had in place? And so oftentimes we're helping connect nonprofit organizations with credible research that is out there to help support their mission work, and ultimately get to be able to say, for example, for every dollar that we invested in this particular effort in this school, $5 is now going back into the community, and here's why.
Okay. So what you're talking then, it sounds like, is there's a understanding the goals. So what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And then how do we measure to determine if we're moving that needle with respect to those goals? And then linking the results of what we're doing to studies, as you said, that already exist, to see then what the dollar or community impact of those goals are.
You are a quick study. So exactly as you're saying, I mean, imagine the time that it takes to prepare for that kind of planning, right? The longitudinal planning or longitudinal approach, as opposed to, 25 students attended our nutrition education program.
Okay.
But then what, right? So funders are now asking, then what happened? And how does this add to your mission impact?
Okay, so then what nonprofits need to do, based on what you're saying, or if I'm sorry to put words in your mouth, but I'm good at putting words in people's mouth.
You are.
It's identify what it is you want to measure, identify what the meaningful goals that are going to come out of what I'm going to measure, and then determine how that feeds back into the social return on investment so I can sell it to investors.
Yes. And there are many different strategies to tracking progress that
good, because that's what I was going to ask next.
Maybe you were going to talk about dashboards, maybe you were going to talk about other methods, but we are in a visual kind of state of mind right now. All of us, we want to see things visually, we want to see things that look beautiful. Actually, in our NSS approach, we say, make it count, make it easy, make it fast, make it visual, and make it a story. So those are the elements that are important. But going back to conveying impact, our attention spans are so short.
I'm sorry, what? I wasn't paying attention.
Exactly. So short. I mean, I had a colleague tell me recently that she's posting 30 to 45 second impactful videos, extremely well done videos about a cancer research center. And she knows that people are only watching the first 10 seconds from analytics. So that's what you're dealing with here. You can even put out a 30-second capsule and you've got people for 10 seconds. So with that in mind, don't think of your potential donors any differently. Don't think of your board members any differently, or even your staff sometimes, because an organization should be looking for a dashboard that effectively conveys their top line metrics. That said, those metrics come in different categories. You could be talking about internal metrics, to evaluate how your organization is doing on the inside. External metrics, financial metrics, programmatic metrics. And so there are a lot of effective ways to set up visual representations of your data that can, result in those aha moments for your various target audiences.
So we're going to go back to the question I asked before that you've already answered with the answer depends. So how many of those metrics should organizations, how much is too little and how much is too much? And I know you're going to say depends again, but can we try to get something that maybe gives some meaningful?
So if you're looking to really connect with a potential audience, for example, so say that audience is potential clients, anything you can get on one page, that's kind of a starting point. Can we identify our most important metrics and get it on one page?
And when you talk about one page, I'm assuming you're not talking about itty bitty font. You're talking about pictures and graphs and stuff like that. So it's as you said, make it pretty.
And you know what? This is a good way to think about it. Elevator pitches, right? We all get nervous, but literally if we're trapped in an elevator and someone says,
I'm screaming help. Sorry.
Trapped meaning going very efficiently up to your floor.
Got it.
Think of those Manhattan elevators that skip 10 floors at a time.
Yep.
And you have 10 seconds and someone asks you, how do you know your organization is successful? How do you know your organization is achieving its mission? And
that's when I reach in my pocket, I pull out my little infographic and show them.
Boom. So it has to be something that can be conveyed in that time frame.
Okay.
Now, if you're talking about the financial side of things, I would argue the same thing. For your board, you should have a dashboard that can showcase your organization's financial health. Board members should be able to grasp how your organization is doing financially in that same time span. If that finance committee has it all together, that should be something that's readily available to board members. So when it comes down to it, it's about communication, effective communication. And in today's day and age, we have high expectations for how quickly and how concisely we receive this information.
One of the things that I hear from organizations all the time when we talk about impact and we talk about measuring impact, they feel that their organization is a little different. It doesn't run the same way. There's no hard fact numbers that they can use. It's more esoteric and it's all story. And how do you get around that? How do you get around the fact that I'm going to give you a survey and you're going to fill out a survey, and how do I then take the results of that survey and put it into something meaningful?
Well, I'll first say that storytelling is incredibly effective. Anytime I've run a press conference in my past, we tried to incorporate a story and even more so a story told by someone affected by the organization, because that's what people remember. Now, at the same time, there's always a way to quantify how your organization is doing. There are always metrics that can be defined. So it's really just a matter of taking a step back and figuring out what those are. And if that's a challenge, that probably stems from the fact that your organization's processes might need to be tuned up a little bit. Maybe your database isn't something you can rely upon. And if you're using an old Excel sheet, that's fine, but are you keeping it up to date? Are you actually inputting your information as close to live time as possible? So I would say to organizations who say that it's difficult to quantify, it can be. It can take time, and it takes making that a priority. And that is tough. We work with a wonderful client who actually performs life-saving surgeries on animals day in and day out. And so not only is the leadership there running the organization, they're also physically performing surgery on animals, right? So we completely understand that mission critical work can get in the way of making sure that defining metrics and all of these other competing priorities are also taken care of. But what we really try to stress is for the long-term sustainability of your organization, you have to be able to answer the question, why are you successful? Tell me how you are successful, and that has to be quantified in some ways.
Are you finding that donors and government funders are asking that question more than they have in the past?
Absolutely. And I would say I started noticing that even 7 or 8 years ago, sitting down with some really demanding foundations in Manhattan and wanting strictly the numbers. And it was really an aha moment for me, seeing the dynamic of my colleagues from different wonderful nonprofits serving older adults throughout New York City, telling stories of how senior citizens have been positively impacted by a particular program, and the foundation saying, what about the numbers? How many folks are you reaching? What is this going to mean for the long term? In this instance, we were talking about, to give an example, we were talking about food insecurity, people having a hard time paying for food. Believe it or not, it's an issue not only in our state, but throughout the world still. And so the foundation wanted to know, well, if you connect this many folks to this particular benefit, how is that actually impacting the economy? Have you done the research to know the multiplier based on how many folks receive food assistance? The local economy is likely to benefit in this way. And so really kind of taking it several steps forward to be able to talk about that longer term impact.
So again, I think that comes back to what you said before when you talk about outputs and outcomes. It's no longer just a matter of how many people am I helping, it's how am I helping those people. And more than that, on the micro and macro level, micro being how am I helping the people, macro being what's the impact I'm having on the overall economy or the overall problem.
Yes.
Excuse me. So if I have a problem with food or hunger, how am I changing that?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
And it's not easy, especially if you're a direct service organization, because you're going to get taken with the clients that you're assisting. I was in a meeting earlier this morning with an organization talking about how they're making an impact on homelessness, particularly homeless veterans. And the leadership person representing the organization couldn't help but mention a particular case of how by the way, one of our young mothers really needs a vehicle, and now we can accept vehicle donations. So it's hard to separate from the immediate emergency needs of those you're serving to focus on top line metrics, to focus on how you're conveying your impact, how you're putting resources toward marketing and communications. But all of these things result in your organization being more sustainable over time.
Yeah, I think one of the things you find is that in any business, and nonprofit, as you said, is nothing more than a business with just a different purpose in mind. I think you find that a lot of times the leadership gets caught up in crisis management. They get caught up in the day-to-day instead of focusing on what they need to do to move the organization forward. And I think that's one of the big ways that I guess you help organizations too, in terms of helping them think strategically, helping them think forward and everything, rather than just focusing on today.
Indeed. I mean, we facilitate a lot of conversations. We talked a couple weeks ago when we saw each other about the scarcity mentality, right, that many nonprofits have. And it really is a shift in the approach, because oftentimes if you're approaching your marketing strategy in the right way, it's not a spend on marketing. It's a spend you're going to get back, fourfold, fivefold. If you really take the time to make sure that strategy fits in with your overall strategic planning efforts, and is placed in a way where you're dedicated to it, your processes support that. But it's always a challenge.
Yeah, always. Let's kind of get into one of the other areas you talked about that your business is involved in. Let's talk about boards. I find that one of the issues that the nonprofit sector deals with on a regular basis is how do we go out and find good board members? It seems like anybody who's out there in a top position here on Long Island, or even New York State, are being asked to be on 27 different boards. So how do you find good board members, and then how do you get those board members to stay engaged within your organization?
Well, those are tough questions. It's funny, every time I talk about how we help nonprofit boards, a comment comes up, oh, I know the most dysfunctional board, or, oh, I've been serving on a board, but I don't even know if I'm doing the right thing. I'm trying to help. And so a lot of this, comes down to managing people, effective communication at the heart of it, and strained resources. So to answer your first question, finding the right board members for your organization is really a struggle that many are faced with, especially newer organizations, but even seasoned organizations, because oftentimes there are board members who are no longer contributing to the organization, but yet they've stayed on the board because maybe there are no term limits. And while term limits are a best practice, they're not for every organization, because some organizations have such valuable members that they don't want to risk
Right.
that lapse and giving them an excuse to escape their board. So, we help organizations really think through their network and think through the types of skill sets they want and need for their board, because it's not just about folks with the deep pocketbooks. It's also about, if you're strained for resources and you've got a one-person marketing team, maybe you bring on a board member who has a marketing focus, who's an experienced marketer, and their role can be partnering with your staff person in some way. And so, as I say that out loud, governance and the approach to governance is also important to think about. And our recommendation along those lines is generally board members should be like a helicopter kind of circling above the organization. They zero in, when there's a need for guidance, when there's the need for, of course, those fiduciary check-ins, but not involved in the day-to-day work. However, some smaller nonprofit organizations really depend on board members in those early days to partner up with staff, to be more involved. And so there's no right or wrong way necessarily to approach this, as long as the communication is clear. So what's something that you talk about a lot? Board contracts. Yep. And I don't mean to alarm any of the lawyers who are listening. The word contract, maybe agreement, maybe commitment, something. This is not a legal document, but what it is a job description of sorts, or a listing of having your board member or potential board member just check off boxes that say they're committed to attending 80 or 90% of the meetings.
They're going to show up at fundraising events. They're going to get involved. They're going to take the time to understand and do things in between meetings. One of the things you find a lot of times is board members show up at a meeting, and then they come back a month or 2 months or a quarter later for the next meeting, and they're like, where were we?
Yep. And you know what? Something that helps a great deal with many organizations is defining their onboarding process for board members. So taking the time, and even just if it's when a new board member is coming on, okay, now let's tackle this. Let's make sure we have, it doesn't have to be super formal, but some sort of organized onboarding process, because then you have a board member getting engaged through that process. Another best practice is pairing a board member up with an existing member as not necessarily a mentor, but it could be, but a person to go to, because a lot of what happens when boards become extremely disorganized or dysfunctional, as I was talking to someone this morning about, is because the organization's leadership, the executive director or the board chair, is overwhelmed and unable to give the attention that their board needs to really grow, to really be more engaged, to communicate the right information. And so strategies like having a board member pair up with an existing member could be just what that board member needs. Because I know even for me, I cringe thinking of, with the board I serve on, a great organization called Hunger Solutions New York. I always like to mention it. I hesitate to call the executive director. She's one of the busiest people I know. And I do not want to impose on her space and her, very packed day. And so having that partner board member to go to, someone who served before you, can make it so that your questions get answered as a newer board member, while learning more from someone who's not the executive director that everyone's relying on.
A couple points that come up. First of all, have you heard of organizations that maybe in kind of response to the last thing you just talked about, where there's maybe somebody internally or a liaison within the organization that can actually serve that role instead of the executive director if the executive is overwhelmed, whether it be a staff member or whether it be a volunteer, as you said, maybe a former board member who's, instead of being paired up one-on-one, but that they could be like the sounding person that everybody goes to.
Well, that's a great point. There should always be that person. There should always be a staff point person in addition to the executive director that board members can go to. It's just unfortunately, oftentimes with the capacity strain, it spreads to that, that staff person as well. And so it could have the board member might feel the same hesitancy in contacting that staff person as well. So we have seen more success with a board member being paired with a peer.
Okay.
Because they're having that same experience. And so it's more relatable. It's a more engaging way kind of to get acclimated to the new group of board members.
One of the other things you were talking about is kind of coming up with the composition of that board. How do you strategize what a board should look like? How do you determine what are the components that I should have on the board? And I assume that every organization is going to have some similarities on how they design a board, but then there's also going to be some unique aspects of how they put together that board.
Absolutely. So there are certainly areas that are consistent throughout organizations. You want someone with that financial background that you can rely on to lead the finance committee. You want someone dedicated to your nominating committee, or if you call it something different, that's fine, to continually grow your board, be focused on that. So there are elements like that that should be consistent. There is also an element of this that is unique to every organization. So oftentimes, and what we recommend is within the strategic planning process, organizations will identify areas where they need support at that strategic level. So that could be oftentimes when it comes to resource development, when it comes to the development strategy as a whole. So if there's a challenge in terms of connecting with the right partners, is there a board member who has the types of connections that you're looking for?
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned earlier, in terms of marketing and communications, marketing is even sometimes a word that nonprofits hesitate to use and say outreach instead, but marketing and sales are really important for nonprofits. You had a guest on talking about sales,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
I was lucky that early in my career, when I was at AARP, a sales trainer was brought in to train our staff. And I thought, sales, but I'm not selling. Well, by the end of the meeting, it was clear we're all selling.
That's what we all do for a living. Yep.
We're all selling. And we want our board members, we want our staff to be armed as ambassadors of our brand, whatever that is. And so if you don't have that expertise on your team, if that's where you see a hole as you're going through your planning process, those are the types of board members. Maybe you, in your planning, you make a slot and say sales experience, marketing experience, and then you can target your network and target your search.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's important to really understand what are the needs, and needs change over time too for an organization. I could have certain needs within an organization early on in my development of the organization, and then as the organization moves on and I hire more internal staff, the expertise of what I need from a board or the needs of what I need from the board might change also.
And also thinking about what the next generation of board members is looking for. Mm-hmm. We talked a couple weeks ago about how event sponsors are different now. Businesses are looking for a different type of involvement sometimes with a nonprofit, different type of partnership. Well, board members are too. Oftentimes board members want to be involved in the organization more so than just writing a check once a year. And so it's also just having that conversation.
I was going to say, I also find that a lot of times, you bring a lawyer onto your board and you assume that they're going to be the legal representative for you, but that's not always what the lawyer wants to do. They want to maybe join your organization because they're much more interested in the programmatic aspects of what you're doing. So you got to be careful there too.
Yes. And that goes into having that proper onboarding process, because during that's when you can ask the board member, how do you want to contribute? How do you see yourself bringing value to our organization. And you might be surprised by what you hear. You know, if you come on to my board, I'm thinking, yes, he's going to handle everything we need related to accounting. And you might say, nope, I'm not touching it, because day in and day out, that's all that you do. And so you will find that with board members. But the bottom line is, if they want to help your mission and they want to see your organization succeed, it's just a matter of tapping into what gets them going and what they want to do.
You were talking earlier about committees, and you mentioned finance committee, nominating committee. You hear different schools of thought within the nonprofit sector. Some believe that there should be a very robust committee structure. Some believe there should only be 2 committees. What's your thought process on committees and how committees should be effectively used?
We see a more robust committee structure as being more effective most of the time, because it's another touch point. It's another way to be involved with a different cohort of your peers on the board. And so we actually recommend, as a best practice, as part of the onboarding process, inviting a board member, if appropriate, to join a committee. That could even be part of your agreement. Please pick one of our committees, that best fits how you see bringing value to our organization, and join. Now, that said, if your committee chairs are not, fully on board, for lack of a better term, then this ripple effect of responsibility falling back on the chair or the executive director could be an unintended consequence. So a robust committee structure works when you have dedicated committee chairpersons, and that can really help grow engagement.
One of the things you talk about, having a robust committee structure, that also means you have to have a robust number of people who are going, because if you take the same 5 board members or 8 board members and you put them on 27 committees, all they do is meet for your organization, you're going to burn them out pretty quickly. So, do you advise from a committee structure perspective that you don't just focus on board members, but you bring on other outside people also from the community, so that also becomes maybe a way of like a farm system for your board?
Certainly, coming up with an advisory board, kind of a separate group of folks to provide a different perspective for your board and your organization can be great. If you are struggling with numbers, I would say quality over quantity. And so if you're talking about a group of 8 folks, what's a robust committee structure exactly? You have 2 and 3 folks on a few different committees. I think mainly the more you can have 100% participation of board members on committees, that's what you're going for. Because then it's not just your quarterly or however often your board meets, your members are interacting more frequently, and that will help regardless of what your goals are. You mentioned something else about, remind me, you were talking about another part of committee structure?
Okay. That's right. Put me right back on the spot.
No, that's okay. Well, so no, you mentioned if it's only a small group of people,
yeah,
this is what
so,
it was.
So I guess the question comes down to, do you bring outsiders onto the committee?
Yes, that was it.
Go ahead.
That was it. A lot of organizations grow engagement effectively by inviting key staff persons into board meetings, because then the board is exposed to the organization's work in a different way. And that can be really effective.
I think it works the other way around too, because then your staff are exposed to the decision-making process that the board is going through. So that increases the ownership of your staff, because then they feel they really understand and connected to the organization.
Yes, it goes both ways. And when we saw each other a few weeks ago, we were talking about organizational culture and growing that. And so by inviting a key staff person in to talk about your latest innovative program or your successes, you're getting the board excited about what's happening, and they're hearing it directly from someone who's actually doing the work.
Right.
And then the staff person is feeling more a part of the leadership.
Right.
And bringing folks together like that, it really grows engagement across the board. So you have your staff and your board.
You talked before a little bit about communication and communicating with your board and the need to have effective communication with your board. How do you go about doing that What are you seeing out there in the marketplace? Because I think that's a place where nonprofits are falling on their face a little bit. Keeping those lines of communication open, giving the board exposure and access to the information they need to be effective leaders, making sure that the board has, connection to the other board members and even understand how to reach out to them. At times, I've served on boards where, if I needed something, I'd have to reach out to the executive director and say, hey, can I get the, email address of X, Y, or Z, who's either a board member or a committee member or something like that. So, how do you suggest that whole engagement and communication gets enhanced?
Yeah, so it's something that kind of sounds simple, but for anyone who served on a board, they know if you want to find the bylaws, oftentimes, and I have done this, I'm embarrassed to say, I spent 30 plus minutes searching through my email to find these darn bylaws. And is it the most recent version? And I've been on a committee of only 3 where I've had a fellow member say, who's on our committee again? Yeah. Because we're all so busy. And so what we recommend is considering a one-stop shop where you can organize all of your board-related information. There are many options. We, as I mentioned in the beginning, have a board portal called Bell's Board. There are other ways to do this as well. But what that does, if storing everything effectively in one place and allowing communication to also result from that. So it's not finding, searching through emails to find this meeting information. It's not searching through emails to find the latest strategic plan or find board member Z's phone number because you don't want to have to call the executive director. It's empowering your board members to be able to access this information anytime they would like to, and also continually reminding them through notifications that can result of reminder, we're having a guest speaker at the board meeting coming up, and all of the information for that board meeting, you can find it here. Kind of taking
and also responsibilities. So if a board member in one set of minutes said, hey, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, you can keep an active list of what's still open and who's responsible, almost like a way of monitoring each other.
Yep. In the case of platforms that we use, you can project manage within the platform. So if your board members are involved in a given fundraising event and you're asking them to review invitations, or you're asking them to be involved in different ways, or simply managing compliance issues like signing off on the annual conflict of interest disclosure, managing that all in one place can really help save the time of the executive director, the time of that staff point person we talked about, and that poor board chair who's making a dozen extra phone calls to sort out this information. So communication is work, but there are definitely ways that organizations can make it easier on themselves.
And your portal, Bell's Board, does all that?
Bell's Board does all of that, and it really makes it easy for board members to go in and look at this information when it's convenient for them, not searching through email. It's that one point where they can go and find whatever it is they need related to their board of directors.
Cool. So we've talked about the board. Now let's move things a little bit to internal and talk about management a little bit. One of the statistics that are out there is that a large portion, I don't remember the exact percentage, but a large portion of the leadership of nonprofits is going to be turning over within the next 10 to 15 years. What impact does that have on a nonprofit organization, and how should nonprofits be preparing for this transition that's going to be occurring?
That is a great question, and it's hugely important, and a lot of organizations and businesses stray from addressing succession planning head on. It's really important, even if your executive director is effective, engaged, and everyone thinks that person will be around for the next 5 to 10 years, it's still important to have the conversation as a leadership team and as a board, what if?
Especially with the mega millions at $488 million these days.
Well, a lot of people do say, if the lottery comes my way, I may not be here. I may be elsewhere. We get that. No, but we talk with organizations often who are going through leadership transitions. And there are tough conversations to be had. And other important things to think about too, in terms of institutional knowledge and where is that preserved. And that goes back to thinking about what databases you're using, and is the information there, stored with integrity? Is your information and data being tracked properly, so that should a change occur in your leadership, it's not, well, only Mary knows where that is. And that's a best practice as it relates to any transition of responsibility.
Right.
We all want to be prepared for that. And so we talk with organizations often about solidifying and actually having those processes documented. Because when you're focused on your mission, when you're running around like crazy, literally trying to save lives, oftentimes documenting something like that can fall by the wayside.
I even find that in a lot of instances, the job descriptions don't even come anywhere near what people are actually doing. And there's a big disconnect between job descriptions, organizational charts, titles and everything else. None of it seems to kind of come together.
Yeah, it depends on your team, but we've done exercises where we've asked leadership to ask their team members, pull out your latest job description, and then also give us some feedback on what you'd like to be doing, or how your role has evolved. And let's talk about that. And that can be an engaging way to hear from your team members on what they like doing best, because we all know that when you're asking...
For me, it's vacation. It's my favorite part of my job.
When you're in the office.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And not climbing Mount whatever, can climb last, who knows. When you ask people to do something that they like doing, they're going to do a better job.
Right.
So this is all part of, management 101, if you will, but it's not easy. Just because it's 101 doesn't mean it's happening, doesn't mean it's easy. And especially with a nonprofit that's newer, that's in a growth stage, it's hard to also dedicate time to those things.
I'm going to throw a complete monkey wrench into all of this. Just because I'm just from listening to you and all of the cool insight you have. So talk about maybe a project that you worked on that you thought was really, really cool and different, and kind of the difference you made with that organization. Because I think a lot of times when you can kind of share examples and share stories, I think that resonates with a lot of people. So maybe if you can kind of talk about something that you worked on that you thought was like really, really cool and different.
Sure. So we work with a lot of boards of directors now, as it relates to board development as a whole, or as it relates to helping them get acclimated to using Bell's board. And we have seen some really amazing engagement and some amazing aha moments of board members saying, we're in the 21st century now. Wait, we can just find our information like this, or we don't have to print out our 100-page board packets before every meeting. And it feels good to hear organizations realizing that change can be good. Moving forward into a digital solution can be not scary. When organizations have been doing something one way for a while, and doing something different can be something that people kind of get tense about. We have seen board members who said, well, I'm nervous about even sharing my information in this way. Everything has been previously done on paper. Come around to say, wow, well, this is actually a lot easier. So in particular, we're helping a board of directors up in Rockland County, a couple up in Rockland County, actually. And this is a social services organization, extremely large, and in the midst of a merger. And so we have seen how this method of organizing two boards of directors coming together has just made the process so much smoother and more streamlined. And in addition, being able to use dashboard reporting in an effective way to keep board members abreast of why the organizations are successful and how they can work better together. So that's been really rewarding, because mergers can be tough. I mean, that's That's kind of an extremely
You just open
high
up a whole new can of
intensity
worms.
level.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, while we don't help with mergers directly, it's very rewarding to be able to provide support for organizations that are going through that.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're seeing out there in the marketplace is, and we think the trend is going to continue, is there's just going to be an increase in the number of mergers that are taking place and collaborations that are taking place within the nonprofit sector. It has to be.
Yes.
I mean, you're moving towards, shrinking fundraising, government regulation. Government has made it pretty clear that they're looking for economies of scale, and they're looking for larger organizations they want to work with smaller administrative structures and everything else. So it's just kind of moving in that direction.
We encourage organizations, especially, this happens to me a lot now. Oh, you help nonprofits? I want to start a nonprofit. I was thinking, well, have you done your research on the landscape to know if the mission that you're considering working on, what other organizations might also be working on that? Please look first to see what other organizations are doing a great job in that particular space, because oftentimes, there's a lot of duplicity in the nonprofit space, and there's amazing opportunities to partner, to merge if the stars align. But that is definitely something.
Or even just to add a program or specifically fund a program.
Yes.
I don't think I don't want to say that there's not new innovation that exists in terms of what people can do within the space. But I think if people just open their eyes and do a little bit of research, as you said, they're going to find a situation where something like that probably already exists, or there's an organization that's kind of aligned with their way of thinking, and they could be much more effective and be much more efficient kind of working with an already established platform.
Yep, absolutely. We encourage organizations to go, taking this actually all the way back to measuring impact. Once you're comfortable conveying your organization's value, then you can determine where value could be beneficial to your organization, where you're maybe not as strong, and maybe you see a fellow organization doing something really well. That's the great thing about the nonprofit sector. People are typically open about sharing best practices and working together. It's just,
so the whole aspect of collaboration. I mean, one of the things we're also seeing a lot more is that because there's and it bothers me, I guess, there's such an emphasis on not spending on administration, like administration is a bad thing. Yet infrastructure is so important for the ability to grow, as going back to the whole impact thing, to gather information and everything else. I mean, to sit here and think, oh, we're effective because we got our administrative costs down to 6%. Well, you can't function like that for too long. Any thoughts on that?
It's a big topic, and I really appreciate you and give you kudos for featuring that at one of your events. I think it was last year. This word overhead now has this connotation attached to it in the nonprofit sector that's really unfair and it can be damaging. If an organization works to get their percentage so low on administrative spending, they could be doing their organization a major disservice. And so while we agree with the guide stars and foundation centers of the world that transparency is of the utmost importance, that means looking a little bit more deeply into what an organization is doing and how they're achieving their mission, and not just looking at that one particular number. It's a lot more complex than that.
Especially when government funders don't want to pay for administrative costs, and when they do, they're putting limits. I mean, you got Executive Order 38, which basically says that if you're going to take state funds, you have to keep your administrative costs down to 15%. And when you look at companies and businesses and stuff, I mean, that's a little unrealistic to think that 15% is sustainable over a long period of time. You want to be in a situation where, like I said, you can build that infrastructure, you can build the tracking mechanisms, you can understand communication, you can put in place those marketing components to what you're doing, as you mentioned earlier, and how that's important to put in place, marketing components and stuff because, we're going to cut back on what you're doing, but we're going to really put handcuffs on you in terms of trying to grow your business other ways.
Oh, restricted funds, it's like this dreadful term. I mean, all a good nonprofit organization wants is really trust,
Yeah.
unrestricted funds
Discretionary dollars. Yep.
to do what they need to do. And we know that's not realistic when it comes to a lot of government funding. And there are probably people listening right now who are basically robbing Peter to pay Paul within their own organization to make their programs work, given the constraints that are put on this funding. And so that's where I think nonprofit leaders are some of the hardest working, most creative thinkers out there, because I think, as we heard on our panel a couple weeks ago, we had a business person turned nonprofit executive director say, well, this is way harder than any business I've ever run.
Yep.
Because the amount of regulations, I won't even get you started on that path, that organizations need to follow, paired with the restrictions on funding, can make it really difficult to do what they set out to do.
And the impact if you get it wrong. I mean, if a business owner gets it wrong, maybe they don't have the profitability that they would like to have. But if a nonprofit that provides housing or food or something like that, if they get it wrong, somebody doesn't get a meal, someone doesn't have shelter, again, just the end result is just tremendous if you don't get it right.
It's an immense responsibility, following through on some of the mission work that we see folks doing day in and day out. Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, it's tough. So we're coming down on time here. So do you want to talk a little bit maybe about some of the key takeaways that you'd like organizations to get from this?
Sure. Key takeaways. There are a few. I would say if you leave with one thing, it's think about what are your organization's key performance indicators? What determines if you're successful? If you had to answer that question in 5 to 10 words, what would you say? And taking that a step further to think about how you're measuring your impact. Make that a priority. Make measuring your organization's impact a priority. That would be a key takeaway.
And is that from a donor's perspective in terms of going after dollars? Is that from a government perspective? Is that from a just an organizational perspective in terms of how do I want to run my business more effectively? I mean,
that was specifically from an organization's perspective, because by doing that, you will be more attractive to donors. You will connect more effectively with your target audiences, because you will be able to effectively tell the story of your work in not just anecdotal examples, which are wonderful and necessary and important, but also in quantifying and measuring your social impact.
Okay. And from a board perspective, what should organizations be looking at from a board perspective in terms of takeaways from today?
Think about how you're communicating with your board members. Think about if that's serving your organization well. Oftentimes it comes down to starting with how can we improve our communication, and thinking about that continuum of engagement. So I would say the takeaway here is, do you have an onboarding process in place? If not, consider asking a board member to get more engaged in that way and creating that process.
What would you say are some of the key elements of an effective onboarding system?
Key elements would be having information readily available that introduces a board member to your organization, some background on the organization, being able to convey, again, your successes, letting that board member know they should feel good about your organization and what team they're joining, and here's why. So kind of having that information ready to go. Again, like we talked about earlier, encouraging the new board member to join a committee, encouraging the new board member to pair up with an existing member as a way of introducing them to the various parts behind the scenes, conversations that happen that they wouldn't be privy to as a new member initially. So things like that can really help with a new board member becoming.
What information do you suggest that an organization give a new board member when they're first starting so that they can get up to speed in terms of, I know you talked about having a mentor and being able to communicate that way, but I find that a lot of times the first 5-6 meetings, board member really has no idea how an organization makes money, how they know the mission, but how do they function within that mission and everything else.
Well, an important first step, and sometimes it's assumed that this happens, but it actually doesn't always
It
happen.
doesn't happen very often. Happens less than you think.
Having that one-on-one with the executive director or with the point person on the staff to walk a new board member through as much of the organization's background and structure as possible is really important, but not just doing it that one time. Having consistent meetings, especially if it's a newer board member, and that's where it really helps in pairing them with a peer, because then it's not putting that additional strain on the leadership or the staff point person, but they're getting that additional background on the organization. They're going to have questions that they're not going to want to ask during a board meeting, because we all feel like that we're the new kid in the room. You know, we don't want to ask potentially a question, but I say to all new board members, ask, make your voice heard. That's why you've been asked to join the board. So that's important too. You know, there's not a bad question, especially as a newer board member.
And then in terms of providing information, you talked about, you know, meeting on a regular basis, but there's also that whole aspect of providing board members, whether it be an executive director report or committee reports or program reports or something, so that they continuously get information over the course of the year, so that they understand the issues, they understand the risks, they understand all of that type of stuff.
And the best way to do that is an effective dashboard, a series of charts that convey how your organization is doing both financially and programmatically in a visually appealing way. Getting to that is what we have seen be successful, because board members are not day in and day out with your organization. They connect quarterly, maybe less often, unfortunately, sometimes, hopefully more if they're on a committee. So
Right.
being able to see that quick snapshot of a dashboard and having that dashboard be up to date is really, really important.
Okay. Any other pearls of wisdom you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap this up?
Well, I would just say we talked about a whole lot of different topics over the past hour, and I would just like to thank everybody who's listening, including my parents, if they managed to connect to Facebook Live down in Southern Maryland. And thank you, Ken, for doing this, because a lot of businesses, you know, don't take the time to serve the nonprofit sector, and you make it a priority in everything that you do. And we are just really, really excited to partner with you guys.
Appreciate it. Why don't you maybe share your contact information for anybody who's maybe interested in getting in touch with you and talking to you and learning a little bit more?
Sure. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, our Facebook page is a great way to connect with us, Nonprofit Sector Strategies. I'm Christine Deska. I'll even give out my office line, 646-902-1550. That's 646-902-1550. And on email, it's cdeska@nonprofitsectorstrategies.com. That's a little long, sorry.
It's okay. This was totally awesome, because again, as you said, we did touch on a bunch of different topics, but what was cool about it is that we did touch on a bunch of different topics. And a lot of the other ones that we've done have been, again, more pigeonholed into one specific topic. So it was actually kind of fun to bounce all over the place, because that's when my brain works anyway.
It was a free-flowing conversation.
So cool. So thank you. So tune in on noon on April 11th. That's a Thursday. We'll be speaking to Mark Gajowski from Magi Inc. He'll be talking to us a little bit about what's happening in the nonprofit sector in terms of pension plans and what organizations need to really know and understand from a pension perspective. So once again, thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you next month.